Welcome to the final session in the Pandemic Perspectives Autumn Seminar Series. Delighted to have yet another fascinating piece of research. Another intriguingly collaborative project, this time with academics from Leicester University, working in cooperation with Shout Out UK, a multi-award winning educational platform, and Cartooning for Peace. Present here today, and I'll try and get everybody who's here, Dr Fransiska Louwagie from the Associate Professor at the School of Arts at Leicester, Dr Levine, who's the Deputy Director of the Leicester Institute for Advanced Studies, Sarah Weidman and Carla Blackmore, who are research associates on the project. There'll be a video contribution from Lucie Spicer, who represents Shout Out UK. Big group of people, and the work is fascinating, and I can't wait to see the outcome. The title is lengthy but fascinating: COVID in Cartoons, Empowering a Thick Narrative of the Crisis by Promoting Cultural Literacy and Diversity and Skills amongst Vulnerable Young People. And I won't attempt to précis in entirety what the project is, because our speakers are going to tell us about that, but a short version would be that it's an AHRC funded project, and in the course of it, the scholars and their collaborative partners developed a 4-lesson mini course on political cartooning. And this involved an interaction with professional cartoonists intended to help young people make sense of their pandemic experience and thereby build their creativity and their sense of agency and belonging. And I'll shut up now and let the experts talk to you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, David and Liam, for having us this evening. It's been nice to follow your series throughout the semester, and it's also great to be here tonight and to present the project. So thanks also for introducing my colleagues. And you're right in thinking that we are quite interdisciplinary. So my own background is in literary studies. I work at the Institute for Advanced Studies that advances interdisciplinary studies at Leicester. And so Sarah's background is in psychology and Kara's in anthropology, amongst other things. And indeed, so Ismail has recently joined us as a creative fellow. So he is a cartoonist from Palestine who is affiliated with the Leicester Institute for Advanced Studies. So that's just so you know where we are coming from at this. And so Sarah is working on quantitative data for the project, and Kara is doing the qualitative side and the focus groups, and we'll be telling you about that today. And we also have Charlotte King, who is also from the Leicester Institute for Advanced Studies, who is part of the Leicester team and worked on the media and communications and impact side with us. And as you've already rightly pointed out, so we are working with 2 fantastic organizations, which make this a very fascinating project for us as well. So on the one hand, Shout Out UK, and they are a third sector enterprise who work on political literacy, broadly speaking, and media literacy. And so Lucie, as you said, will be doing a video contribution from their side. And we also work with Cartooning for Peace, who collaborate with us on the creative side of the project and on the educational side. And so we are lucky enough to be able to use a lot of the cartoons from the archive, and you'll see that also shortened as CFP on the kind of little references on the slides. I'll first hand over to Dai, who will be presenting some of the aims of the project.
So when the pandemic hit, this was a little bit of a moment for us to stop and bring together some of the thinking that Fransiska and I had already been having over some years, really, about the potential power or otherwise of visual media to understand children and young people's experiences and the ways in which they make meaning of their lives on a day-to-day basis. My own background, as Fransiska said, is very interdisciplinary. I don't really know what I am anymore. I think I know I'm interested in the way children and young people survive and thrive when life is really tough. I think this project has been perfectly timed in order to explore exactly that issue. So what we aimed to do was to work with Shout Out UK and Cartooning for Peace to build a mini course that could be delivered in schools either virtually or face-to-face in the UK during the COVID period that would have several aims. We wanted to be able to foster young people's critical consciousness, which we'll expand on in a little bit more detail a bit further on. But for a kind of quick summary, we can think of it as a critical understanding of the social and political climate in which they're living and about the pandemic specifically. We wanted to encourage young people to engage in dialogue, both with one another, but also kind of introspective dialogue, which they can do through the arts around sharing their personal experiences of the pandemic, to help them to make meaning of the pandemic, which, as I said, was a kind of something we'd been thinking about for a long time. And then as part of thinking about these resilience pathways, building their criticality, supporting them in building senses of agency and belonging, because we know those are all very crucial dimensions of making the most of the resilience pathways that we have at our disposal. And then also to raise aspirations and promote really great outcomes for young people at a time when actually sometimes there has been very little recognition of the kinds of outcomes that they have generated and the ways in which they have flourished during this very difficult period. So yeah, I hope you'll really enjoy listening to where we've got to so far. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to hearing people's comments and questions further down the line.
Thank you, Di. So the first question that we wanted to answer before we kind of start giving more detail about the project is the question, why do we use political cartoons? Why are we working with political cartoons? And we thought we'd address that question first before telling you a bit more. And political cartoons are already used in educational contexts, and they are seen to have specific educational advantages because they are, as you can see also from the example on the slide here, they are quite accessible because they are visual, because they are visual. Again, they are considered to be universal and kind of speak a universal language. They use humor as well, and which is then seen as an advantage in the sense that it allows people to engage with difficult issues in an engaging and non-threatening manner. At the same time, so we have found that to be true largely. At the same time, there are also some educational challenges of which we have had to be aware. Despite the claim that they are universal, of course, there are, despite the claim also that humor is non-threatening, there are a number of sensitivities. So humor is also not necessarily universal. And then what has also been quite interesting in the context of the project has been to think about media shifts and where political cartoons sit today. Because we haven't, obviously, we talk a little bit in the course about the history of political cartoons, and they become very common and widespread in the 19th century with the printed press and the newspapers. But in today's world, of course, the status of newspapers has changed, and young people are not so familiar necessarily with the concept of a political cartoon. So we have needed to work on that and to address that as part of the course. So whereas traditionally you might have had editorial cartoons attached to a newspaper and part of a kind of editorial line, we now have a lot of political cartoonists who publish on social media. And so their practice has changed, their readership has changed. And in terms of, we have done a number of interviews and interventions with cartoonists, and they describe, for instance, how they have to adapt to people looking on phones and smaller screens, also incorporating different types of references because they are in a kind of environment where people are focused on things like memes. So they draw on different references maybe than previously. So they are part of a changing environment, and the way in which young people and the young people we work with engage with political cartoons is interesting because it's not necessarily straightforward. It's not necessarily part of their daily environment. So to some of them, this is relatively new, despite the idea that we might have about political cartoons as being something very widespread and well established. So cartoonists do see advantages of the social media move because it gives them a different type of reach, a different kind of audience. Whilst they may no longer be part of an editorial line and a newspaper, they do feel sometimes that it allows them to build an individual profile. For instance, because on Instagram or on Facebook, they can post their cartoons and people follow them and get to know their way of thinking. They can also sometimes put videos about their creation online, and then it gives insight into the process. So again, it creates a kind of more personal connection with the audience. There are also definite risks of cartoons on social media, particularly political cartoons. So a few interesting comments we have had on that is, for instance, one from Zapiro, so a South African cartoonist whom we will mention again later, who said that when there were national newspapers, they kind of reached everyone, and that with social media, it's more divided into small pockets. So people might not necessarily come across everyone, and they might only speak to a certain audience in a way which goes against the idea that the audience has increased, perhaps. Yeah, there are some risks attached to that, because that then opens also the fact that they are easily available online and that they are available in small pockets, opens up some risks of manipulation, co-optation in different contexts from what has been intended. Cartoons can also be read out of context, which again may lead to misinterpretations or to negative reactions, and sometimes whereas in the past maybe a cartoon in a magazine may have been intended for a specific audience. That's also something that we have discussed in the past with our colleagues at Cartooning for Peace. Now you might reach an audience that maybe you hadn't in mind, and then that creates certain tensions as well. So that is an interesting background into where we are today with political cartoons, and also how we have to think about how young people might interact with them. So what is then specific today about political cartoons, and how are they useful today, and also especially in the context of the pandemic? It's interesting to see how cartoonists describe their own mission. So some will say we have a journalistic intent, we are also a journalist. They may say we don't take positions for or against certain things, we have a kind of journalist view, as opposed to people who create memes. Perhaps they still have a kind of professional ethos and position, so they speak from an expert position. Some of them do have a practice that evolves towards social activism, and that diversity also makes for a very rich landscape. And in the context of the pandemic, that has really given us a kind of step into discussing different sides of the experience and different sides of the difficulties that people are going through today, because the cartoons speak to power, and in the context of the pandemic, where politics have been so incredibly important, that is something important. They also use humor, which has been an important coping mechanism during the pandemic. And finally, they also shed light on situation, and maybe show us sides of society that might go unnoticed. And this is a quote from Platevoet, who is the founder of Cartooning for Peace, so a French cartoonist. And he says in his book about the year 2020, his kind of annual, which is called État d'urgence, so emergency state. He says, in fact, we will live a social tsunami, and it will not be easy for the drawer to illustrate such a crisis, because you have to be à l'écoute, listening, to the forgotten ones of the Republic. And then he says, without pouring oil on the fire or adding fuel to the flame. So it's that interesting mission that they have of asking questions, showing those who are maybe forgotten and not so present in the narrative, and then also being aware of the risks that political cartooning involve, and that is the kind of starting point for our course, that we have this medium that offers so much ways into the pandemic, and that we use as a stepping stone for young people to talk about their own experience, and also to think critically about what is happening around them, how the pandemic is being managed, what the effects are on people, and that is where our course comes from. So we deliver it to 15 to 18 years old, so in collaboration with Shout Out UK, who do a fabulous job in liaising with schools. And so we have a four session course. The 3 first sessions are delivered normally in-house by the teachers in the school, which is quite interesting, because we might have teachers from various departments who come and teach the course. And then the final session is run with a professional cartoonist from Cartooning for Peace, and that is online, due to the context of the pandemic, and also due to the fact that the cartoonists are very international. And we have actually also been looking at an alternative delivery format, where there would be drop-in days, and we would deliver the whole course in one day. And that is something that would again be done via Shout Out, but we are reassessing that in the context of the new guidance received yesterday, and of course the way that impacts in schools. So it's been a fluctuating kind of delivery. We've been in schools, out schools, also for the focus groups. So it's an unpredictable situation also to run this kind of research project. So I'll just take you very briefly to the themes that we address in the 3 sessions, so that you just get a sense of what we do with the pupils. So in the first session, we explain what is a political cartoon. As I said, the students are not always very familiar with it. And we look with them at the toolkit that is used in political cartoons, notions like metaphor and paradox. And we also make them understand that political cartoons are a critical type of discourse, and how that relates to issues, relating to politics and freedom of expression and so. In the second session, then once they have this basic understanding of cartoons, we look first at experience of the pandemic, experiences of lockdown, experiences of things being unpredictable, different experiences of time. And from there, we also look at issues that might affect, their own experience, but then also what the experience of other people might be and how the experience might be different. And so, for instance, here on the cartoon on the right, you see families in lockdown sending their children outside, and in some cases, of course, they might be more privileged than in other cases, and that has an effect on how people experience the lockdown. And the cartoon on the left then takes that to a slightly more international level, and other structural inequalities, with, for instance, access to the vaccine being very different from country to country. So that is also to make them think about diversity issues and diverse experiences in the context of the pandemic. And then we link that to questions about humor and resilience, and how humor helps them be resilient during the pandemic, and to react and maybe even process just certain situations. And we also link it then to certain intersectional issues, such as gender during the pandemic. And on a more positive note, these are themes into which they can expand. The third session starts with the notion of hero, which is a notion that has been used a lot during the pandemic, and we've had a lot of heroes, and also new types of heroes, people who were not necessarily seen as a hero before the pandemic, so such as on the left here, the hairdresser, and of course doctors and scientists and teachers. And then we talk about that, who their personal heroes were. We also look at how the discourse of being a hero has been used, and how society treats its heroes. So, for instance, on the right here, you have a slightly ironic comment on no more heroes. We're back to just cashiers again. Yeah. So it's also about how discourses about the pandemic are being used, like also the discourse of we are all in this together, as you saw with the structural inequalities. That's not necessarily the case. So we are also using then the political cartoons as a tool to make people think critically about what they are being told about the pandemic, and to assess narratives, and to develop critical thinking skills. And of course, because we then talk about the doctors who are heroes, we also you will probably recognize the doctor in the middle here, who was not allowed to speak out in China as a whistleblower. So we also talk about the tensions between politics and science, and how certain heroes are not allowed to speak out, and again how different narratives contrast political discourses versus scientific discourses, as you can see here on the left, and then also the role of journalists. And that brings us back then to the role of political cartoonists during the pandemic, and what their contribution is, and how much they are able to speak out. And that brings us then in conclusion to a kind of reassessment of what the function of political cartoons is, and how also for young people cartooning, but also beyond that, just critical discourse helps them to phrase opinions, and to build agency in a constructive manner. And then you have this cartoon that illustrates how you can have a critical tool that stands apart from violence, and that is a pathway to resilience. And so building up across these 3 sessions, then in the final session, the pupils get to meet a cartoonist who discuss how they have been practicing political cartooning during COVID, what their perspective, and also because they are often from different countries, what the situation has been in their country, how they have reacted to that. and they do live drawings on iPad, so the pupils can follow what they are doing, and they are also set the brief. So last Friday we had a session with someone from Denmark, Lars Scheffen, and he set a brief about COVID and Christmas, which worked really well. So on the left you see his live drawing, and on the right you see some drawing from the pupils. And then this week he sent us his finalized drawing about COVID and Christmas, and of course with a reference also to the South African discovered variant, I shall call it. Yeah. So that is the project in a nutshell. And there have been some challenges in delivery, as we were already mentioning, not only because literacy levels vary, but also because in the context of the pandemic, pressures on schools have been multiple. And we have, been trying through this project to help students maybe process part of the pandemic, or to at least also, if they have had a positive experience, maybe think about what they have learned and what their skills have been, and how that feeds into resilience pathways. So we think, it is important as part of what is called the recovery curriculum, that students get a chance to process their experience and think critically about what their experience has been and what it could be. But obviously schools had to go back to a core curriculum, so that has been a bit of an interesting challenge to find space for this kind of activity. And other elements have been also because we have tried to work also with deprived schools. There are also some practical elements in terms of having cameras and being able to interact with the cartoonist. Working with various teachers has also been very interesting. Of course, as I said, they might come from different backgrounds, have different types of knowledge. They get a lot of teacher materials, a teaching handbook, and for us it's quite interesting because we also get teacher feedback then on the course, so that kind of gives us an additional insight into the course. But yeah, it's every school is different in a way, so we can't really say this is now the format and this is how it will be. So it's a kind of ongoing process. And also we have, as I said, worked with remote delivery, which has given us access to a very international wide range of cartoonists, which have been great. Yeah, and then the research methods that we have been adapting is something our research associates Sarah and Cara will talk about in more detail. If that's okay, I'll just start the video now from Lucie Spicer, who is the head of education and technology, and so who has been working with us on delivering the course. She comes.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Lucie Spicer, and I am the Head of Education and Technology at Shout-Out UK. I'm sorry that I can't be there today to be able to talk about this, but hopefully a video will be enough and will potentially stop me talking over the allotted time. So I just want to talk a little bit about kind of the project. You've hopefully all heard about our mini course and kind of the sessions that we've run, but I want to talk about the kind of framework that we have been working with in terms of thinking about this and putting this in schools and kind of educational institutions, and thinking about the connection of how teachers have had to deal with these particular issues that have come up before, and kind of how this is a almost supportive grace that they have. So one of the elements that we want to talk about first is kind of the political literacy element. So this is kind of thinking about political literacy education, how it's not really just an understanding of how our democratic system functions, but also kind of the fact how it thinks about how it also encompasses the skills that are needed to understand and engage with one's own political system around them. So it's not just the understanding of the knowledge, but it's the application element, which is really important to everything that fits in with this course. We have a responsibility to introduce and employ critical thinking in our classrooms, essentially, and political literacy is just one way to do that. The course element works great. The project that we've done so far is really getting the young people to equip them with those skills, those critical thinking skills of application and evaluation on top of the knowledge element. This is why I've kind of had this element of thinking about the role that teachers normally have when they're tackling these controversial issues, and in particular British values. So this is a guidance given to most schools in the UK, to think about how they talk about these topics, and it is through democracy, rule of law, individual liberty, respect and tolerance of different faiths and beliefs. Now, normally when a teacher has this, their kind of understanding of this would be to let me define democracy, let me define rule of law, let's define individual liberty, let's discuss respect and tolerance of different faiths and beliefs. But it's through this project, through political cartooning and understanding political cartoons, evaluating political cartoons, and the application of thinking about the journalistic and artistic elements of political cartoons, that we can really get to grips with the so-called British values. So kind of thinking about democracy, rule of law, what is it democratic, what we're talking about? Is that particular political situation democratic? Has there been emphasis or elements of rule of law? Was there a continuation of individual liberty? And that feeds into the whole project. So from project element to project participant, thinking about the cartoonists in this kind of schema, and really getting them to understand British values in a new way, in a new application way. And I think that's something this project does very well, and something that we need to think about in kind of thinking about the projects and engaging with schools, is how we can link what we're doing with what the school has to do in terms of targeting, in terms of achieving those Ofsted elements the school has to achieve. I also want us to think about the infodemic and think about media literacy or information literacy or critical media literacy, however you want to define it. But I mean, we have to think about the fact that young people and pretty much everyone now is immersed in this kind of diverse and sophisticated form of media culture. And so it's from cradle to grave at this point. And that is really something that young people are going to have to tackle with. So again, bringing in these critical concepts of understanding media and evaluation of media is really important, and something that we also thought about in kind of tackling these issues, not just the concepts and the topics, thinking about how anti-vaxxers or, kind of understanding through like a COVID schema of this kind of vast, problematic push of conspiracy theories and anti-vaxxers, and kind of those, debates and discussions or arguments happened online, but really getting young people to think about where political cartoons are, where they're going to engage with them, because we know that young people engage with social media. That's where they get their news from, rather than traditional newspapers, and that's where political cartoonists are creating and pushing their cartoons now, their political cartoons onto. So that's a really important element. So it's a part of us to kind of really support teachers to navigate in discussing these important issues, these controversial issues of structural inequalities, thinking about even the pandemic is quite controversial sometimes for teachers to talk about. But through this, they have a sort of crutch, an ability to kind of think about this in a new way, while also ensuring that those skills that young people need, evaluation, application, critical thinking, emotional resilience, even public speaking and debating elements are included, and getting them to really build up those skills while also tackling these really, concepts and topics that they might have shied away from before. And that means that they bring new life to this kind of British values element, and kind of ways of bringing in these controversial issues that the teachers feel comfortable in dealing with. And I think that really goes back down to thinking about the powerful ability of political cartoons to kind of draw from the issues today, to reflect them, to kind of bring other people into the discussion, and kind of the big concept of political cartoons are created by artists but also journalists, and it's a comment on what is happening in a particular situation, and you have to have the resilience or the emotional resilience to be able to understand, evaluate and determine where you stand on that issue in response to how much political knowledge you have, or if you need to know more, and whether you agree or disagree. And that can be through looking at it through a humorous lens, or looking at it through another type of lens, but really engaging with those issues. So yeah, that's all I really wanted to talk about, but really just thinking about re-engaging with this and the kind of the schema that we deal with. I hope you have a great rest of the talk. It goes really well, and hopefully we can re-engage about these concepts a bit later. So thank you very much for sharing this video, and yeah, we'll hopefully speak to you all soon. Thank you and goodbye.
Hi, I'll just jump in to say we've created a couple of infographics just to give you a sense for the scope. So you've seen a bit of the content, and then this gives you a sense of the scope for how we're working. So the is it the previous or the next slide, Franziska, about the schools? But here we're looking at the participating schools. So as you see across the map, we're trying to get good distribution that is in urban and rural context, that is in, the South and the North. And what's been really interesting for me doing the focus groups is being able to go there and see the range of students and the experiences that they're having. And we've been trying to work with schools that have a certain level of students on free school meals. So that indicates certain potential vulnerability in the population. And as you know, we can talk about maybe more in the Q&A, the detail about the students and their positionality. But I think it is really valuable to see that this is something that we're able to activate through our partnership with Shout Out UK. It's their networks that they have in these schools. And so they're activating those networks to create the collaborations. And then similarly, if we go to the next slide, we see how the collaboration allows us to, as we're reaching out into the schools, also bring in the cartoonists. So here is another infographic that we've created to show you a bit of the distribution of the cartoonists, the professionals who run the final session. And they come from the Philippines, from Ethiopia, from Tunisia. There's a Venezuelan cartoonist who's based in Mexico. So they're getting all these different perspectives and able to understand the biography of the cartoonist in relation to the experiences in the UK. So we see how these partners are able to activate it. And then I'll pass it over to Sarah, who will talk about the quantitative research, and then I'll jump back in on the qualitative side. Over to you, Sarah.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. I was going to thank Lucy, but she's a video, so I guess there's no point, is there? All right, so Franziska's talked a lot about the research aims and the course itself, and we've heard from the Shout Out UK side. So I'm going to jump into the research bit, look at our research questions and the methodology. So this is a mixed methods project. So we've got some quantitative I'm going to talk through the surveys, and then Kara's going to talk through the focus groups and the qualitative data collection. So hope that works. So we, for the surveys, we have students complete questionnaires before they take part in the course, and then also after they take part in the course. And these are some of the measures that we want to learn more about. And you can see that these are reflected in the research aims. So for instance, before taking part in the course, we want to understand the students' experience of the pandemic, get them talking about their own experience. One of the things that we're interested in is where they get their information about the pandemic, the news, any interests that they've taken up over the pandemic, their cartoon literacy. So this is how comfortable they are reading political cartoons. That's one of the things that we focus on in the course. We're also interested in resilience, as we talked about at the beginning. The measure that we're using for resilience is the Child Youth Resilience measure. It's a subscale of personal resilience. And then this is also related to, which I'll talk about a little later, is this idea of critical consciousness. So this is the critical understanding of their social and political climate, and then also the agency to change this. So just an example of an item of this on this critical consciousness measures. This is the measure of adolescents, specifically critical consciousness, would be it's important to contribute to my community and to see if they feel like they can contribute to the community. So that's the kind of questions that we're asking. And then we're also looking at their attitudes towards humor. So as Franziska was talking a little bit about earlier, is this idea, humor possibly be this pathway to resilience, and how comfortable they are talking about their experience of the pandemic, and to family and friends and teachers. So those are the questions we're asking. If you want to just hop over to the next slide, brilliant. And then we're also looking at a change, so how the course itself influences these measures. After the course, we're also asking students to share their experience, kind of evaluation and feedback about the course. So I'm just going to show you kind of where we are thus far. So as Kara was talking about in the maps, you can see we've already reached, I think it's about 10 schools. This is just some data from, this is 184 students have filled in this pre-survey, and these are just some of the findings. So first of all, when we're asking where students are getting their information about the pandemic, social media is clearly the #1 source. So you can see here, 53% of students said that social media was the #1 source of information about the pandemic. Almost all students said that they got information about the pandemic from social media. And this is in clear contrast to, you can look, there's online news apps, but newspapers, less than 3% of students said that this was the #1 place. So when we're thinking about where students are actually might be seeing political cartoons, it's clear that it would be social media. We're also asking about any interests or initiatives that they picked up over the pandemic. And this was really interesting. So we have more than half of the students said that they did take up new interests. This is just some examples, so art, baking, sports. And we had quite a few students say that, you know, there's some students who started a small business or came up with academic interests. So this is also something we're looking at as, you know, possible signs of resilience here. Cool, I think, we've gone to the next slide. In relation to attitudes towards humor and discourse, we are generally seeing that students are reporting positive attitudes towards humor. And this is just an example. This is 81% of students agreed that they were able to find things to laugh about during the pandemic. And we're also looking kind of at the relation between this and political cartoons and using political cartoons to talk about issues around the pandemic. And then we also were finding that in general, students felt comfortable talking to family members and friends about issues around the pandemic, less comfortable talking about to politicians, for example, which isn't extremely surprising, but is an aspect of this idea of critical consciousness and feeling like you can kind of have agency to make change. So this is just, this is from the pre-survey, right? So this is what students reported before taking part in the course. If we go back to our research questions, we're really interested in how these constructs relate to each other. So one of the questions we had was this relationship between resilience, humor, and critical consciousness. So again, this is from this 184 students. We are seeing these positive associations between resilience and critical consciousness, so their understanding of social and political climate. And these are significant moderate correlations, and also their attitudes towards humor. So this is, you know, what we were expecting. But it's nice to see this coming out in the data that these students who have this these positive attitudes towards humor, it does seem to be associated with their resilience. If you want to pop, brilliant. And then also we're looking at again, so this is after this is post-survey after they've taken part in the course. Around half of the students said that the course helps them discuss their personal experience of the pandemic. So we've encouraging the students to talk about their experience, to draw about their experience, reflect on their experience, and they did feel like it helped them talk to their peers and gave them a deeper understanding of the pandemic. And this is also something we've seen reflected in data from the teachers. These are just some quotes from the students who've taken part in the course. Some of my favorites here, you can see, you know, they learned that very big messages can be told through very little words. I also liked this, a student said, I learned that you can contribute positively in the form of art. So these were some nice takeaways. If you want to swap to the next one, brilliant. And then we've also been asking the teachers to feedback as well. So of course the teachers are delivering the course. So they're delivering the first 3 sessions of the course. And we have found that they come from a lot of different disciplines. So they've had teachers, art teachers and politics teachers and English teachers. And generally, and this is more of an evaluation because it's the first time we've done this course, that the teachers have all said that they were comfortable with the course delivery, which was nice on our end, designing the course, and that it was at about an appropriate level. If you want to go to the next slide, this is probably the more interesting takeaway here, is that the teachers also, a large majority of the teachers said that after doing the course, they were more likely to use political cartoons as a teaching tool in the future. And they're also more likely to foster critical discussion, so that the type of critical discussion that's part of the course in the future as well. And some of the other takeaways, this is just again, a couple of snippets here, is that they also said that generally the literacy, the cartoon literacy at the beginning of the course was quite low. So the students really weren't familiar with political cartoons, but that there really seems to be an increase. And we did find this in the data as well. I didn't include that, but there is a significant increase in the students' confidence reading political cartoons. And the other thing that teachers like, and actually that the students like as well, is this really international aspect, and kind of looking at the pandemic in different countries and across different student experiences. Is what's coming up. So I'm actually going to pass it on to Kara now, and she might talk a little bit more about this, about the qualitative side and the focus groups with the students who took part.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I'm just going to briefly talk a bit about the methodology and some of the insights that we're getting. As we said, this is an ongoing process, so it's being shaped and reshaped by the conditions that we're in, and data coming out also based on what the moments of the pandemic are that we're in and the schools are in. But just to echo also what Sarah was saying about the teachers, the interesting part about the focus group too is it becomes kind of an extension of the course. So it feels like another session, and it's formatted in such a way that it becomes a very interactive call and response style session that the students can engage with. So I've done focus groups with numbers as small as 5 and ones as large as 18. 18 is not ideal, but I think with the schools organizing it, sometimes they want to be able to get more students involved, and so we have some larger numbers, but then you can kind of subdivide and break that down a bit more. But just to give a sense for what this visually driven call and response style methodology is, I'm going to briefly talk about what this 5-point system that I use. And so it's a series of directives where the images themselves that are done by the political cartoonists through the Cartooning for Peace network are the kind of calling agents, and then the students respond, and there's a series of questions that then tie into the research objectives. And this goes to the part of the research that Fransiska was talking about, this idea of building a thick narrative of here we are on pandemic perspectives. What are the perspectives of young people and their own experiences, and how can we elicit that through a visually driven focus group format? So what I do is I kind of start with a way to ask them to get their own experience, and to give you a sense of what this is like. We've got a data bank of over 200 images that have been done by cartoonists in over 50 countries that are all around the pandemic. So these are printed out and distributed across the space to students, and they're asked to rapidly sift through them and find an image that reflects their own experience. And then they describe that image and talk about why it reflects their experience and what it says about their pandemic perspective, right? And so that works with the visuals, and sometimes those images are the same ones that have been used in the course. Sometimes those images are ones that the professional cartoonists have used in their sessions. And it gets the students seeing that they can understand their own experience through a shared experience, a potentially universal one that's happened in different parts of the world, or indeed in the UK itself. So this lays the groundwork for that and kind of opens up the space for a discussion around these local and global issues. So I asked them to identify images that would speak to the idea of the local and the idea of the global. And that can be local in terms of their home, in terms of their neighborhood, in terms of their school, in terms of their region, or global in terms of a larger universal or even different country perspective. And as Fransiska mentioned with the cartoons, and as you saw in some of the previous slides, there's lots of different languages that these, so we've got, you know, French by virtue of our partner organization, but there's also Hebrew and Spanish and Arabic and multiple languages that come in these. So sometimes students will select those just because the global is something different, something outside. But this helps us to discuss what these diversity and international concerns are. And then it opens up a space for us to go more specifically into these issues of politics, right? And as was mentioned earlier by Lucie, that sometimes the level of political literacy is quite low. And so when you ask students to select images that look at these questions of politics and power, they really have to engage that criticality, and they have to look at sort of images where agency is located in different places, where different characters have different sets of power, and then reflect on those. And this sometimes is a difficult section because there's a hesitancy around the politics. So you have to assage what politics as with a, you know, proper noun politics, and then social politics or everyday politics or politics of the body or the pandemic. And then we shift away from the visual side and go more specifically into the narrative. So by this point, the students are much more familiar with the images and familiar with this process of reflecting on the images. And as you'll see in the selection of 2 images that I shared here, we use Post-it notes. So they're asked to share their commentary on the images, why they select them, what they think of them in the focus group space, but then they caption them as well. Why did they choose it, or what does the image say to them? And that helps us to create a kind of narrative dialogue, so that when we get to the 4th directive, where they're asked to build their own dictionary in their own words, they're used to putting language to these issues and to these questions. And what comes from that is a series of definitions, words, phrases that students are able to articulate around the pandemic, and helps to give us as researchers a kind of narrative that they have articulated in their own words. And then the final aspect of that is a drawing one. So we go from selecting visuals to narrating experiences in a specific dictionary format to a drawing one. So you've got a broad spectrum of how students can engage during the focus group, and again, reflecting on the course format. So this is what we use that's called the sketch and reflect. So you ask them a question and then they draw from that. And the question that I ask in this is to get the students to imagine their post-pandemic utopia. What does the future look like? And by projecting into the future, we're able to understand the now, to look at the past. And often what happens is students think about the future, but they have to have a present or a past contrast to it. And so they'll use images from professional cartoonists that are in this space as prompts, or they'll use certain conventions, and I support them in that. So using things about time, the before and after. And if I go to the next slide, where I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the findings, you'll see one of these. So this one on freedom and confinement is an example where they've created a dividing line. So sometimes we have this as a temporal line, sometimes we have it as a spatial line, but sometimes we have it just as a singular moment. So the image where it says we can finally hug again, this is a student drawn image where they imagine their post-pandemic utopia. But you see that utopia is also locked in this mask wearing moment, right? So they don't imagine that something we're experiencing now will totally go away. They imagine that it's still there, but we can create a closeness or an intimacy. So I'm sort of in the thick of it now with the focus groups that we've done, taking this material and trying to analyze it. But what I would say is that that there's many shared experiences across the schools, and that often the narratives, at least in the dictionary side of things, tend to follow mainstream pandemic discussions. And so when you ask them to think about words that were new from the pandemic, words that have changed meaning, words that have come into their vocabulary, we see the same things coming up over and over again. So we see masks, we see online learning, we see social distancing, we see, you know, these terms that we use day to day in our vocabulary very much showing up for the students. And then we also see from a visual side that students gravitate towards the images that are done by younger cartoonists that seem to reflect some of their own experiences. And I think this goes to this point about power and agency, that they're able to locate themselves somehow, somewhere in the images, and especially in that first directive where we see that students are gravitating towards images where they can see themselves. As a sort of precursor to this, we've been doing some analysis around professional cartooning. And one of the things we found too is that through the survey of images, young people feature very seldom. And when they do feature, they're not agents of power. They're almost always agentless, right? And so this is interesting to ask them to locate themselves and how they locate themselves when the overall corpus of images doesn't necessarily reflect them as agential actors. And the other thing that's interesting is that they seem to understand the social issues, and this goes towards the points in the course around intersecting issues, is that they understand the social and the political issues, but they don't always see them as politics. And this seems to be an interesting sticking point around the pandemic, is that we as academics or people who have high levels of political literacy understand all of it as politics, and the whole range of politics, the social politics, the body politics, the government politics. But when we frame it in that language with young people, there seems to be, unless we're in a specific politics course, a distance that's created that the focus group helps me see how we can bridge that. So echo some of the points that were made earlier. And maybe one thing I'll add on this too is that one of the interesting things for me in the focus groups is that we've been seeing, in a way, a counterfactual to some of the problem statements around vulnerability and concerns of students, in a way that some students are grateful for lockdowns, have enjoyed certain lockdowns. So how you have, on the one hand, for example, one student who went without power and gas in Liverpool and would leave to be able to go to the shop because the shops were warm and that's why they wanted to go shopping. On the other hand, you have students who are very socially anxious and enjoyed being outside of the school space, right? So the focus group allows us to see this range of experiences and to understand the narratives that young people have, and then to reflect on where their agency is and what kind of issues they're dealing with, so that the resilience pathways can be mapped out accordingly. So I'll stop there, and if there's any more questions, I can speak to those at that time. Over to you, Di.
Thanks, Cara. That was fantastic. I always feel very inspired when I see those examples of what the young people have drawn over both the focus groups and during the course as well. I wanted to just take a moment really to encourage us to acknowledge the complexity of the space in which we're operating, and also to just give you a little bit of a sense of what we're actually going to do with all of these data, because Sarah has presented you with some of the kind of the survey-based stuff that we've been kind of exploring, and Cara has presented with on some of the kind of more qualitative work that we've been exploring. But actually, while we value the expertise of our individual colleagues within the team, what we're trying to do is answer questions together. So the processes of data integration, the conceptual frameworks in which we are operating are going to be really important, especially as we go into the kind of final sort of 9 months of the project. So I wanted to just focus a bit on resilience, because we've used that word quite a lot. But I wanted to focus a bit on it just to give you a sense of where we are, where our thinking is actually lying within that space. So, we acknowledge problems with the term resilience. It's been used and abused over the last particularly 10 years in quite dramatic fashion. I think we've taken quite a pragmatic approach, and one based on existing collaborations that we have with people like Linda Turon and Mike Unger, who've very much influenced our work and thinking on this space. And really, our kinds of definitions really arise from those Southern African, in particular, definitional spaces. So we're not actually, for once, we're not taking a kind of minority world perspective on something and applying it in a majority world perspective. Actually, we're taking a majority world perspective and applying it in the UK context. So that's been a really interesting process in and of itself. And what we really mean when we use the term resilience is how people survive and thrive, or how people cope when life is hard, which is actually the definition that Linda came up with the young participants, the teenagers that she was working with already at least 10 years ago now in South Africa, because there wasn't at that point a term for resilience in isiZulu. So that's the kind of broad definitional approach that we're taking. But actually what we're thinking about is resilience as a process rather than as a trait. And we're resisting very heavily, you'll see in the measures that Sarah's talked about there, the CYRM approach to measuring resilience has been one that we've acknowledged that it's not a trait, it's not something that you are or are not, but rather it's a combination of the different systems in which you are operating, some of which may be internal, but many of which are going to be external. The current terms in the psychosocial space around this at the moment are your ruggedness and your resources. So your ruggedness being the kind of inward things, the optimism, the sense of hope, the agency, the sense of belonging, and then your resources are the things that really you do crucially draw on more widely. But what we're trying to really do, this diagram here is one that Linda Turon and Mike Unger came up with, that tried to explain what the challenge was. That really, if you imagine a child, an individual child or a young person right at the base of that kind of middle circle, and you can see that around them are these biological systems, particularly for adolescents. We cannot ignore the absolutely crucial life stage that our participants are going through. And the fact that, as Sarah Jane Blackmore has said on many occasions, you can't understand what it is to be a human being until you understand what it is to be an adolescent, because it's such a fundamental age and stage in our lifetimes. The psychosocial systems, the social environment, the built environment, the natural environment, all of these things form very complex systems. And what Linda and Mike have suggested is that actually we're not interested so much anymore in what happens in these individual systems. So, we know quite a lot already about the impact of the natural environment on an individual's resilience, or the built environment on an individual's resilience. What we're interested in is this sort of ellipse in the center where the little crosses are. We're interested in the relationships between these, what matters most to whom and under which circumstances. And really what we're doing in our project is using this as a bit of a microcosm for just one small aspect of these issues. And we're asking ourselves questions about all the different measures and different perspectives that both Sarah and Cara have talked about. Is critical consciousness a resilience pathway? Is it a risk factor? Is it a protector factor? Is it both? And if it's both, what are the implications for practice in schools, particularly in a context where schools are being asked to take on so many mental health responsibilities in a way they never have before to quite this extent? We really want to help them to understand, okay, well, if I teach critical consciousness, is that actually going to be a risk factor for resilience. If you feel like, you know, you're critical of everything around you and there's no hope, that is going to have an impact on your resilience. Or does creating a sense of, you know, being articulate about your perspectives and having a sense of agency and understanding ways in which you can change your own world, even in some small way, is that a massive protective factor? So these are the kinds of things that we're trying to unpick. And in the process of creating the code book, which we're going through at the moment, drawing together these multiple strands of perspectives to try and understand what is happening in these young people's lives. And then hopefully we'll have an opportunity at some point to reflect some of this back to them and say, okay, well, what do you think? I feel like we're starting to kind of maybe shade in one teeny tiny corner of the ellipse, maybe in the combination of the biological, psychological and social diagram in the multi-systemic model of resilience. So that was just a little kind of insight into the way that we are thinking and the direction of travel in which we're going. Super interested to hear people's thoughts on that. Is that okay, Fransiska? I could witter on about this for hours, so I have to just check.
No, thanks a lot, Di. That was great. Thank you. So I think we will leave it at that as a presentation of the project. I'll just mention very briefly so that we also have done a project in some ODA context. So we have worked with partners in Kenya and Ivory Coast and South Africa on some political cartooning projects as well. So if you're interested in that, we can also compare across nations, but we will not go into that now. And then we also have briefly recently for the past month actually as part of the Festival of Social Science, so Sarah and Cara and a third research associate James have been running a cartoonathon on again in partnership with Shout Out UK and Cartooning for Peace. So that is also something that we can, you know, talk to you a bit more, as it also involved working with young people, but maybe we can do that as part of the discussion and leave it at that. Thank you very much.